Well, good afternoon to you all from Adelaide in Australia. It's a pleasure to be with you again on behalf of my organisation, the AARN, and of course in conjunction with the people at Mile. As Ali has said, this is the second of our series of 3 webinars concerning public-private partnerships, and this one deals with the actual practice of PPPs. What we're going to do is look at some history, some case studies, and some principles. Let me begin with just putting us in the picture in terms of these series of lectures. The first lecture was an overview of the principles, and it was really a session designed for those who must make the final judgment in the PPP decision. It was an overview of that kind. This lecture is the first about how to advise those who must make the judgment, and it aims to give useful information and evidence, and to do so in a balanced way. The final webinar in 4 weeks' time will add the last steps. Now, that will be about how to make the case for a PPP. Now, please note with regards to this afternoon's presentation that I can provide only the essentials of the cases that we're covering. The details of each case are, of course, available. Our team at AARN can lead you through the contractual arrangements in each case, and these are all generally variants of the outline that I described in the first lecture. Of course, feel free, please, to contact me or our team for any of the details. Okay, let's begin with the take-home messages. And the take-home messages from this webinar are linked to those of the previous lecture, where I said, in principle, PPP arrangements can provide significant benefits. I also said that in practice, proposals must be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And this lecture reinforces those messages. It gives real-world examples of successful and failed PPPs. It emphasises some common difficulties, and it leads back to the message that you must focus on the details. There are no strong and simple rules. What is needed is a systematic case-by-case approach to the PPP assessment, which is really what the final lecture in this series is about. Okay, then let me just outline what we're going to go through this afternoon. The lecture begins with a very brief recapping of the major points from the last section. Then we jump into the experience of PPPs, and we start with some history. It's important to understand how and when PPPs emerged as a concept. And that leads us into the 2 sets of illustrations I want to provide, looking at the detail of PPP applications. The first concerns road projects built and operated under PPP contracts using road tolls. The second is about hospital projects. And in both cases, I give a general overview of PPPs in these sectors, and then I give you some particular examples. And this leads to highlighting 3 specific issues that are most pertinent. The final task for this lecture is to consolidate these illustrations into some lessons. I've chosen to tease out the messages not just for policymakers, but for private participants too. Now, that approach, I believe, is justified, even though I understand that you are all of you listening, are from government. But nonetheless, it's useful because it's important to view the PPP arrangements from both sides of the contracts. Okay, so let's briefly go back over some of the issues we dealt with last time. What are PPPs? Well, they are long-term contractual arrangements between government and a private company to provide public infrastructure. The benefit for the private party is that it receives payment for the infrastructure. Either the government pays them directly, or government allows them to charge prices for public use of that infrastructure. That second kind is called a concession. And of course, PPPs can be combinations of both forms. Often the private company has a number of parties involved. The lead firm is usually a construction specialist. That lead firm will form a partnership, often with financiers and other private and public sector agencies. And this specially formed company to undertake the PPP process is often called a special purpose vehicle, and I will refer to them generally as SPVs during this presentation. So under PPP arrangement, government moves from provision of assets and services to the supervision of the private sector doing the same. In other words, government does not own and operate the infrastructure. Instead, it focuses on ensuring the quality and the quantity of the services provided by that infrastructure. Again, just briefly, let's reconsider the question of why and when to use PPPs. The advantage claimed for PPPs are that they reduce upfront costs, but recognise upfront costs only. Governments spend less now and more later. Of course, the planning is to spend less overall. Another advantage claimed for PPPs is that they allow government to tightly focus on their role, leaving the private sector to undertake activities from which a profit can be made. And because PPPs require detailed agreements, it means that each project is very well understood before it begins. And it means that each party can negotiate a position that matches their desired level of risk and the linked return. In other words, that matches their so-called risk-reward profile. PPPs are also claimed to promote innovation by allowing the private sector to devise means to meet the specifications laid down by government. As we said last time, PPP arrangements are best suited to big long-term projects where the inherently high transaction costs involved in creating these agreements and enforcing them, those high transaction costs can be spread across a big long-term project. PPPs are also best used in projects with relatively low transaction costs. And in other words, we want projects where it is cheap to specify, to monitor, and to enforce the contractual arrangements. And in addition, PPPs are best suited to projects where innovation is required, that being better done by the private sector. Okay, with those preliminaries out of the way, let's now add some new material and think through some of the history of PPPs. It's often recognised, and quite rightly so, that partnerships between the public and the private sector to provide services to the public have a long history, and that is especially true in the delivery of infrastructure. Examples of arrangements which are very similar to the modern PPPs include, for example, French concessions, which were used to build toll roads in the 19th century in metropolitan France. Now, those contracts were similar to those of PPPs in the modern era. They included, for example, government providing restrictions on competitor firms to maintain the concession and the tolls. We have other examples from Canada in the late 19th century where boot arrangements, build, own, operate and transfer arrangements very similar to modern PPPs were used to build Canadian roads. And we have a very early example in colonial India of the Princess Dock in Mumbai, which was built using British finance under a bond issue and a competitive tender to find local companies to deliver the construction. So we can see that PPP arrangements as such are not new, but the term PPP, or public-private partnership, emerged under the influence of the so-called New Public Management movement in the 1980s. Now, the New Public Management movement was based on the idea that government should mimic private sector management techniques, and they should do so in order to improve efficiency. It applied the notion that the private sector is subject to competitive pressures from rivals, and this makes them more efficient. But note, it also emphasises that the existence of private firms is under constant threat. Private firms, as we know, can cease to exist, can become bankrupt. By contrast, governments are much more long-lived and cannot generally become bankrupt. Now, those points have implications for both sectors. It affects the willingness of each of them to take on risk, and it also affects the risks involved in lending to them. Now, those are both critical issues that we will consider in more detail in the final lecture when we look at the issue of risk in more detail. The application of the new public management principles led to progressive change by the public sector. We began in the post-war era with near complete public control of public infrastructure. That being by far the most common arrangement. But during the 1980s, under the influence of the new public management, we moved into a period of corporatisation, and that meant transforming government organisations into publicly registered companies. Then came privatisation of previously government-owned organisations. Now, PPP emerged into this era as a major variant. When they emerged, they were explained as neither public nor private, but public and private in partnership. Now, let's begin our look at the case studies that go with that history, and we'll begin with a case study in the transport sector. Transport infrastructures are well suited to PPPs because they are big and they are long-term. Let's begin with some of their general characteristics. Most cases of PPPs in transport are via concessions. In other words, the private sector SPV is allowed to charge fees known as tolls for the use of the infrastructure. And so they conform to what we described last time as the design, build, own, operate and then transfer form of a PPP. Another common characteristic of transport infrastructure is that it's disruptive to build. Traffic often needs to be diverted onto secondary roads during construction, with attendant costs in delays and congestion. Construction is also often noisy and dirty and happens right in the middle of busy city streets. As a consequence of that disruption, it is critical that the construction phase works smoothly and quickly. But too often there are problems that arise only after construction begins. Now, some of these problems were not only unknown, but were in fact unknowable before beginning. These are so-called unknown unknowns. Finally, transport PPPs illustrate the importance of considering the flow-on effects of the decision to go ahead with a project. Building a road will have powerful effects on the pattern of economic activity. It shapes the way cities grow, and it will create winners and losers and hence political pressures. With those preliminary remarks made, let us now look at some specific examples and elicit some of the particular issues. There are many, many examples to choose from. I have chosen the Kepulauan tollway in Jakarta, Indonesia, as it illustrates many of the problems that might arise. The tollway was a 41-kilometre section of road between Jakarta and Bandung. This corridor was subject to strong demand growth, and the 41-kilometre section was broken into parts, 4 parts initially, but then into a further 9 parts, with the bids from the private sector to cover the construction of all 9 parts as one. As is typical, this was a deboot project, design, build, own, operate and then transfer, and it involving an SPV. That SPV was formed from a local construction company and a UK consortium with access to finance and specialist skills. The SPV was supervised by a government agency specialised in toll roads, and both sides were advised by specialist consultants, though it's important to point out that these were mostly engineers and not necessarily skilled in PPPs. And the SPV itself decided to use subcontractors, in fact one contractor for each of the 9 sections of the road, so 9 local contractors to the SPV. Now, the government was very keen to get the project underway, and to speed up the process it offered financial support by means of a so-called contractors pre-finance system. Under the arrangement, government guaranteed completion of the project, and hence it is in effect guaranteeing payment to the SPV and hence payment to the banks. In return, the banks agreed to lend at the lower risk and lend at a fixed and low interest rate. Obviously, this financial support affected the profit to be made by the SPV. It now carried less risk and obtained cheaper finance. That made it more likely that the government would receive bids and might also have reduced the price of those bids. But of course, the government carried more risk and greater costs, but it was prepared to act in that way to ensure that there was no delay in delivering the infrastructure. Now, problems emerged for this project in the early pre-contract stage. The proponents used a public sector comparator to analyse the financial feasibility of the project, of the PPP arrangement. That is the state of the art, as I explained in the previous lecture, and I will deal with in more detail in the following lecture. The problem was that the proponents negotiated the PPP based on a simple feasibility study, which itself was based on a preliminary design only. Now, immediately, that should be ringing alarm bells. As I have said repeatedly, the devil is in the detail, and this project proceeded without those details being fully understood. This case also shows the importance of relationships within the SPV and between the SPV and the government. The SPV's choice to use subcontractors extensively, but that arrangement lacked coordination, and also it was a relationship that was not within the control of government. And the contractual arrangement between government and the SPV lacked robust dispute resolution procedures. It was, in the words of some academic reviewers, not a partnership, but is more towards a superiority-inferiority relationship. Now, these problems are unfortunately common in PPP projects for obvious reasons. Government, on the one hand, wants to restrict the SPV, but if it too many restrictions simply raises the costs of provision. And of course, the SPV, if you think of it from their point of view, they are very likely to overpromise on their ability to deliver in order to get the job in the first place. But of course, they must not overpromise too much, because they will incur ongoing obligations. Now, generally, this tension between the parties can create an optimal agreement, but as we see in this case, that tension can be poorly and incompletely resolved, and this project was burdened with poor arrangements from the beginning. The problems deepened during construction. A major problem emerged when the road construction revealed the underlying subsoil to be unstable when sodden, when very wet. And of course, Jakarta is subject to heavy rains. This meant increased construction costs. And it's an example of an unknown unknown. No one knew this soil problem in advance. It was only revealed once the deep holes were dug to set up concrete pilings that the problem became apparent. The government responded to the emergence of this unknown unknown by simplifying the design. Now, that seemed to make sense. Government made concessions because of this unexpected development. But the changed design meant a different route was needed. So new planning approvals and further land acquisition were required. And those things caused delay. And that was at the cost of the SPV, because they were responsible for obtaining approvals and purchasing the land under the contracts. More change was made to the project after signing of the contract, and again, this is a bad sign. For example, the diverted traffic proved to be much worse than planned. The toll road was required because of growing demand, but that demand continued to grow during the drawn-out construction phase. However, no allowance was made for the increased diverted traffic. It meant terrible traffic jams in surrounding towns. Government pressured the SPV to speed up the process of construction by enforcing penalties for delay with the new planning approvals. And government itself incurred costs in improving the roads where the traffic had been diverted. Now, in the end, the road was built, and it performed well as a piece of infrastructure. But it's hard to conclude that the project was a success. The private SPV made losses, significant losses, and the project was delayed, and construction imposed considerable costs, external costs, on other parties. In addition, it damaged the ability of the Indonesian government to negotiate future PPPs with other private sector participants. But I would say on the positive side, the failure of this project made government prepare much better for future PPPs. Now, I want to highlight that very often the financial analysis of a PPP arrangement is sensitive to the amount of demand for the infrastructure. If the toll road is too little used, the SPV is unprofitable. And if demand has been underestimated, the SPV is overly profitable and the road remains congested. Now, experience shows that very often the future demand for the PPP asset is overestimated. This being an example of so-called optimism bias. It is prevalent in half of the cases of road PPPs that have been studied. And the optimism bias is more prevalent in toll roads than non-toll roads. Now let me drive home the importance of the demand risk with a second example, that of the Rostock Tunnel in Germany. Now the German government is a very sophisticated partner in PPP's arrangements, and that is built partly on lessons learned in early cases such as this. The Rostock Tunnel used what the Germans call the F model. This was the federal government model in which government part funds the infrastructure with a grant worth 20% of construction costs. Under the model, the tolls for using the road were set by the state governments, the sub-federal governments of Germany. Now, the tunnel was initially built under a 30-year concession with a maximum toll set for the first 3 years. And the effect appeared to be, as one reviewer put it, that the risk for traffic volumes was transferred to the project company. But there was an exception. If traffic predictions were not met due to some factor that could not be foretold or controlled, that is, if it were due to a force majeure, then there were some legal remedies available to the SPV. Now, it turned out that demand projections were overly optimistic. They were based on simple population projections. More sophisticated planning would have shown that demographic change was going on, and that change, had it been incorporated into the predictions, would have reduced the projections. In any event, the region's population actually decreased during the course of the project. In addition, the toll was set at a high price, and people complained at the cost of using the tunnel, and that further restrained demand. Now, these were unexpected outcomes. It was expected that demand would be higher, and that they were so unexpected meant they were interpreted as the result of a force majeure. And that led to the legal remedies I spoke of. In the first instance, the concession was extended by 20 years. In other words, 20 more years of high tolls. I will say the option of increasing tolls was not taken. It was understood that prices were already too high, so that option was ruled out. The case illustrates the problems that can arise when governments lack experience with PPPs. As I say, this was a very early case in the German experience. The outcome was, again, that the infrastructure, the tunnel, was built. It appears to be a success, but the citizens had to pay high tolls for 50 years in total because the demand risk was not in fact transferred to the SPV. And as with the Indonesian toll road, this experience led to reforms with amendments to the legislative base of the F model. Now, the second case I want to mention in this regard is the case of the Bangkok SkyTrain. I don't know if you know it, but it's an elevated monorail right within the centre of Bangkok CBD. And as with the Rostock Tunnel, the underlying arrangements have been imperfect because the demand risk was underestimated. In retrospect, the causes of this weak demand are in fact obvious. The SkyTrain was unintegrated with other modes of transport. Its stations were up above the street and lacked accessibility. And the SkyTrain was only a small network. It had very limited coverage within the CBD. And it was also subject to high fares. Now, these obvious points were not mentioned in the negotiations. They were not part of the lead-up to the signing of the contracts. when those contracts were reviewed after the project got into trouble, the reviews showed that there had been preliminary work undertaken to make use of benchmarks for demand estimation. But Bangkok is very much unlike the cities that had been used for the international comparisons. It has, as anybody knows who's been there, very stormy weather. It has poor footpaths. And that means there is very little foot traffic in Bangkok compared to other cities of similar size. There's more motorbikes and public transport than is typical. Now, this says that the root cause of the problem was the insufficient detailing before the PPP was negotiated and signed. These points were obvious in review, and a sophisticated process would have brought them to light in advance, but that was not done. Okay, I want to now shift our focus away from transport infrastructure and to the very important area of PPPs in the health sector, and particularly to the use of PPPs to build hospitals. Now, in general, PPPs for hospitals are undertaken on a DBOMT basis. In other words, design the hospital, build it, own it for the specified long term of the contract, and maintain the hospital for that period, and finally transfer it to government. In most cases, PPP hospitals are operated by the government within the privately owned hospital. In other words, governments provide the clinical services, by which I mean the services provided by medical professionals. Usually ancillary services such as catering and cleaning services are provided by the SPV. When the government operates the hospital, it makes payments to the SPV subject to the supply of the hospital services as specified in the PPP contract. There are some general characteristics of hospital contracts that are relevant to the PPP arrangement, and the overriding point is that hospitals are complicated assets. It is difficult to specify the minimum service level to be available. Relatively easy to specify the inputs, so many functional wards and beds, so many qualified nurses per ward, etc. But it is hard to specify the outputs, and it's the outputs that we're really interested in. We want to know that the hospital promotes healing, it prolongs life, but there is no firm baseline against which to compare. There are clever ways to deal with this problem, but they are only partially successful. Another difficulty is that our expectations of good outcomes will change during the life of the assets. Medical technology changes significantly over the life of the hospital building, and this changes the specification of good outcomes. This also means that the design of the hospital must be forward-looking. The rate of change of technology means that it must be forward-looking to make it easier to introduce new technology as it becomes available, and that adds to the complications. And finally, and this matter should not be underestimated, hospitals are staffed by high-status professionals. Doctors not only have high status, but they can also appeal to the goal of patient safety. And that means that they are powerful users of the asset, and powerful asset users add further complications to the PPP process. The general advice is that these big, expensive, long-term projects are best undertaken by participants who are experienced in PPP arrangements. If conditions are too strict, contractors can be in breach too readily. They will recognise that risk, and this will be reflected in the value of the risk transfer, and hence they will want higher payments in future to conduct the PPP. But loose conditions can mean poor services or unnecessarily profitable contracts. The tension within these hospital PPPs is quite high. Now, let me just review some cases of PPPs in hospitals that reinforce those general points. The first I want to use is a case from Canada in Ontario, the Brampton Civic Hospital. Now, let me say, as with the Rostock Tunnel, it is important to understand that this example from Canada was the first PPP in the healthcare sector in Canada. As such, it shows the problems that commonly arise. and I would say that Canada, like Germany, has learned from its mistakes. Very briefly, the background to this case is that the city of Brampton was projecting a shortage of hospital beds. The PPP arrangement was seen as a way of providing the extra beds proactively. In other words, in response to the projected shortage and not waiting for an actual existing shortage. The hospital was big, a planned capacity of 600 beds, and the planning for it was well done. Again, the proponent employed the public sector comparator, which showed that the PPP proposal represented value for money. The contracts that were written were detailed, and the result was that the hospital was built on time and within budget. So again, we have an apparent success, but a deeper analysis revealed in the formal review process conducted by the provincial government suggests that the costs have been high and the process has been compromised. Firstly, there is the financial consideration. The PSC was seen to be overly generous in favour of the private proponent, the SPV. For example, it allowed for a 13% cost overrun, and that could still be claimed to be within budget. Secondly, the review made clear that the cost of capital to the SPV over the course of the project was much greater than it would have been had the government built the hospital itself. The review recognised that there might be efficiency gains in having the private sector undertake the project, but these would need to be very big to make up the gap, estimated at 200 million Canadian dollars. Finally, the review emphasised that the concepts and theory of risk are central parts of the PPP process, but it concluded, and I quote, "This case study suggests that program-specific implementation is challenging and actualising the theory of risk is difficult," unquote. Again, that matter of risk and how to account for it are matters for the next lecture. The second factor that militates the conclusion that this PP was a success is the way in which the project interacted with the political sphere. Firstly, the review found that there was too close a relationship between the government officials and the executives of the SPV. They were not sufficiently at arm's length, and there was what is called client capture, where the government officials become too generous and too lenient with the SPV. And that was reflected in the high cost to the government of these contracts. Secondly, this close relationship was only at the operational level. At the higher level, at the level of the provincial government, it was understood that the citizens thought thought the government was responsible for whatever happened. The so-called political risk was not and cannot be transferred to the private sector SPV. So while the officers were too close to the private operators and gave up control, the executive of government insisted on maintaining control, and this created tensions that became apparent during the course of the project. Finally, the PPP arrangement was commonly perceived as a form of privatising the health system. Now, that view was widespread among citizens and the health professionals, and it was distinctly unpopular. There were some early deaths, for example, within the hospital. There always are deaths within hospital, but the early deaths at this hospital were very widely reported, and that led to concerns about the PPP arrangement, about it compromising clinical service quality. And that was so even though the private sector was only providing non-clinical services within the hospital. Now, to complete the health services illustration, I want to highlight two important lessons that they reveal. Too often, the decision to proceed with a PPP is not based on an unbiased analysis. Often the decision is made or nearly made before the analysis is complete. That preempts the fully authorised decision. It biases the subsequent analysis so that it will confirm the PPP path, and I call this problem decision momentum. PPPs are particularly susceptible to decision momentum because these arrangements look best at first glance. Remember, the PPPs mean less spending now, but more spending later. so they appear superficially advantageous, but there can be hidden costs. And too often there is political pressure to get the job done using a PPP, and this overrides any proper assessment. When this is so, even though the assessment of the proposal might be made using state-of-the-art techniques, such as the PSC, the technique itself is compromised. With regards to the PSC, often what happens is they become overly generous. For example, they overstate the costs of construction, or they allow too high a risk premium on the discount rate selected. They can have overestimation of the value of the risks transferred and underestimation of the value of the risks retained. The process is one that gathers momentum. Once the PSC assessment is favourable, even though it is biased, then officers must make the PPP work, so they get too close to the private sector proponent, and so we get client capture. In addition, the higher capital costs of the SPV are now hidden. There is a lack of transparency. Often the full costing is not undertaken until a review that follows a disaster. Now, the net result of this is that good hospitals are built using PPP arrangements, but often the costs of doing so can be high. An example of this, close to my heart, in my hometown of Adelaide here in South Australia. We're about to commission a brand new hospital, part of the largest health precinct in the Southern Hemisphere, $4 billion health precinct, $2 billion hospital. It is going to be state-of-the-art. It's a beautiful new hospital, but it will be very, very expensive. Let me now turn to a second issue that is illustrated by the case of PPPs in hospital service delivery. This second major point is the one that I explained in the first lecture of this series, that the primary requirement of a successful PPP is the detail needed to specify the service levels required. The more difficult it is to specify what is required of the private sector, the less suitable is the PPP arrangement. Now, this means that PPPs are used commonly for building hospitals and for providing non-clinical services, but they are much less common in providing clinical services. In other words, PPPs do not generally cover the operation of hospitals. The reasons are that quality standards are difficult to define. I've said it is hard to specify the characteristics of a hospital building, but at least we can say how many beds and how many operating theatres. It is even harder to specify the characteristics of health service outcomes. So performance measures are subsequently difficult, and the sanctions for non-performance must be delicately balanced. While those points suggest PPPs in health service provision are rare, we have found examples, mainly from Africa and South Asia. And indeed, as an aside, let me, in this regard, thank one of our webinar participants from the first webinar, Mr. Chidi Izua from the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission in Nigeria. Now, Mr. Izua has contacted me over the last few days. Unfortunately, he can't join us this afternoon because of family reasons, but he kindly sent my team the details of 3 cases of PPPs in hospital service delivery in Africa, and they've added significantly to our base of such examples. But let me give you our overview of our review of these cases, which suggests that the PPP arrangements to deliver clinical services vary greatly. We think in overview the failures do exceed the successes. There are examples of success, such as from South Africa, the Free State Hospital in Bloemfontein, where the PPP concerns access to parts of the hospital, not building the hospital, but operating in parts of a publicly owned hospital. But there are also examples of overly centralised, incomprehensive and politically tainted PPPs. Some claim to be successes, but only on the basis of having hidden costs. But let's give an assessment from the World Bank, who reached they reached similar conclusions. It found that, and I quote, contracts in many cases were poorly specified, and I emphasise that it's the specification of contracts that is the difficult part. The World Bank noted success in primary care, success in training, success in ancillary services, but it raised concerns regarding quality standards and performance measures and sanctions. It stressed three basic conditions for government to be involved in this way: a minimum knowledge of the services, the clinical services, sufficient to allow the terms of the contract to be defined, the capacity to manage those contracts, and sufficient funding available to meet the expected demand. Now, in addition to those points, we can add that governments who have used PPPs in this area develop specific institutions to oversee their operation. When specification is difficult, it means that monitoring and enforcing the arrangement is problematic, and for that reason, successful projects are overseen by specialist units within the Ministries of Health and by use of specialist NGOs to advise. The overall point is that PPPs for hospitals are complicated. PPP for hospital operations are even more so. In both cases, this is an area best suited to well-informed, well-supported PPP proponents. Let me now just move on to the final part of this lecture and highlight the lessons that arise from the practice of PPPs, starting with the lessons for government. The first lesson is the project selection process must be robust. Before a PPP arrangement is considered, government firstly must specify exactly what it wants. The detailed specification must not come after the decision to proceed with the PPP. Once the detail is known, the costs for government undertaking it must be estimated, and as I've said, the state of the art is to use the public sector comparator. The contractual arrangements must also be generated from the detailed specification. The government officials need to understand this from the perspective of the private participants. Government must ensure it provides incentives for the private sector to act efficiently. Leaders in government need to understand also that judgment will be required, even state-of-the-art methods, to not make the PPP decision. They are never simple, and there are always complications that cannot be reduced to numbers but remain qualitative. Government should not accept all the risk of unknown unknowns. Clauses are needed that make clear that unanticipated problems are shared problems. The fact that not all risks are included in the contract is not reason government should assume responsibility for those risks. Relationships are critically important. The government sector must avoid client capture, but it must also avoid arrogance in dealing with the private sector. The partnership is about transferring authority and risk, and that requires goodwill. The final two lessons stress one theme, and that is that PPPs are complicated. Experience is needed to get them right. There are two lessons. Develop the experience by starting on small projects, bring together a group of officials with the right training, let them learn the art of PPP arrangements, leave nationally significant projects until later. And get good advice. There is a great deal of global experience, and this should not be neglected. Review the past cases, get independent advice, and benchmark your work against world's best practice. The lesson for the private participants, the number one message has got to be that the private sector must look firstly at the detail that the government is providing. Is the proposal technically feasible? Does the document consider all the materially relevant matters? There are many loopholes and many ambiguities in the next step. Let me indicate some common problems. Make sure that risk is not double counted. And that means that risk can be counted both in the discount rate and the risk transfer calculation. Many times there is double counting. And there's also a thing called the PPP paradox. Now, look, I'll expand on both of those matters at the next lecture. I see the time is running short. And there is also the matter, of course, of sovereign risk that concerns the possibility that government will change the rules of the game in ways that hurt the SPV. That is an estimation that the private sector must make. There are other lessons too, similar to those for the public sector regarding relationships and the need for experienced advisors. But I will leave those for next time and just finish briefly by pointing out again that we have another webinar coming up which will concern how to make the PPP decision, how to prepare the advice, how to deal with the facts and figures, how to add in those qualitatively measurable items. And that's going to happen on the June the 5th, I believe, I think at this same time. Okay, that finishes what I have to say. I'll hand us back to Ali and take some questions from you. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Paul, for a very interesting presentation now today. So folks, we are now open for question and answers. If you have any questions, you could put it in the question box or you could raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your console. Please click on it if you want to talk directly to Dr. Paul Chapman. So let me go straight to the question box, being the first question. Just a second. Yes. Dr. Paul, your examples covered transport and health sectors. Could you indicate other sectors where PPPs have been successfully applied?
I certainly can, Ali. We can look across the whole range of the network industries, particularly in energy, electricity generation, but not just generation, transmission and distribution as well. There are many successful examples of that. Interestingly and importantly, we are starting to see them in renewable energy now. There's more work to be done in that area, but we are starting to see them emerge there. But we can also see these in the other network industries, particularly telecommunications, as an alternative to straight-out privatization of fixed line networks is often the case. PPP arrangements have been shown to be successful in areas like that. But these go on. We can see them really in a lot of the construction parts of public service delivery. So, for example, education, the building of schools, but also the building of law and order assets, particularly prisons, law courts, those kinds of things. These are, they all have those characteristics of being long-term assets, and as I say, big, but it's that combination of size and longevity that we're looking for. So yeah, many examples of them.
Okay. Another question, could you also give us some examples of some of the bad decisions that you have come across in PPPs?
Oh, Ali, there are many examples of those kind of bad decisions. I know that the Bangkok Metropolitan Government is about to engage again on a series of PPPs that look like they might end in a similar way to the one I mentioned. But look, it's interesting to read the case studies in that they nearly all want to tell you how wonderfully things have worked. But if we look at, for example, just to pick some examples, the one I was looking at the other day from Malaysia, the Port Klang, which is a big container terminal, and it's been upgraded over quite some time under PPP arrangements going back to the 1980s. Now, in the course of that period, we have seen a series of bankruptcies. Special purpose vehicles have been created and fallen over repeatedly, and governments have been part of that and suffered financial losses as a result. Again, it comes down to a lack of detailed planning, which of course is easy to say when we're talking about the Port Klang development. That's a port that has expanded incredibly rapidly, and to keep up with it, to find some way to do so has proven to be very difficult. And there have been technical problems with dredging and matters of that kind. There are many examples, I must say, of failure, but they are not readily spoken of as out-and-out failures. There are hidden costs, and there are delays, and there are inefficiencies. And I think that must be borne in mind whenever you're reviewing any of these cases, there's a tendency for them to all to be spoken of as successes. Certainly not the case.
Great. You have made a distinction between systematic and non-systematic risk. Could you further clarify this distinction?
Yes, it's something that we will talk about in a considerable detail later, but we're interested in, when we're trying to find the discount rate that we need to apply to future costs associated with a project, when we're selecting that discount rate, we are particularly interested in the systematic risks, the risks that that pertain to this kind of project. So, for example, if we're looking at the health industries, we would excuse me, we would consider the systematic risks as those risks associated with all health service delivery companies. So we might identify those companies on the stock exchange, create an index which shows the profile of their growth and decline over a long period, and then we would match our firm against that and projections for the project at hand. We would fit them into that picture. So that would give us a sense of the risks that are associated with this project just because it is a project. What we're also interested in, though, are the other risks, the non-systematic risks, the risks that pertain specifically to this project in addition to others. So what we would say is the risks associated with the industry and that are typical, the systematic risks, they can be dealt with by diversification. The private sector can deal with them by diversifying. But the non-systematic risks, the risks that pertain to this project in particular, they are ones which we need to deal with in the SPC calculation. We are going to have to identify them, we're going to have to value them, and we're going to have to determine which party is going to bear them. Now, all of these are matters, as I say, which we'll discuss in further detail when we talk about the components of of how to make the decision during the next webinar.
Okay, we have one last question from Ains Veloso. The question is, what can we learn from the example of Olympiadas?
I don't know that example, Ali. Could you? Okay.
Ines, could you please sort of explain or elaborate, because you mentioned the attendee has mentioned, Mr. Ains Veloso, the example of Olympiadas. What can we learn with it? I don't know, the question popped up in the chat box. Well,
these are the examples that were provided by the gentleman from Nigeria.
Oh, okay. Okay, I think because it's popped up in the chat box, so I'm not getting any other feed on this. So, well, that really brings us towards the end of the webinar now, Dr. Paul. So we understand we are having another series of the webinar on the 5th of June now, right?
That's correct. Yes, Ali, yes.
And this,
I look forward to that.
Yeah, and this next webinar will be on, do we have the topic finalized as such as yet?
Yes, it will be under the heading of how to make the PPP decision. It's really about the how to prepare that advice, how you would go about creating the documents that would make the case for or against a PPP, dealing with the facts and the figures and dealing with the qualitative issues.
Oh, perfect. Sounds very exciting. So thank you very much, Dr. Paul Chapman. Once again, I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship. We are really, really grateful that you are really taking this time to deliver these excellent presentations and sharing this very valuable information on the subject of PPPs. We find it very useful, and so we really want to thank you on your time and your commitment.
That's quite right.
And your commitment in delivering this as a series of webinars for us. I really appreciate that.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. Please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org to learn about the upcoming webinars and also to access the recorded version. Even the last webinar by Dr. Paul Chapman has already been uploaded on Mile Community, so please do visit it, try to access it. It has already been transcribed. The recorded version and the PowerPoint presentations are all archived and accessible for downloads for free. So with that note, we'd like to end this webinar. You all will be automatically dismissed out. You have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.